what you bought, you owned, and what you owned eventually came home to you. There would come a day when he would open the door and there would be Gage, a demented parody of his former self, grinning a sunken grin, his clear blue eyes gone yellow and smart stupid. Or Ellie would open the bathroom door for her morning shower, and there would be Gage in the tub, his body crisscrossed with the faded scars and bulges of his fatal accident, clean but stinking of the grave. Oh yes, that day would come. He didn't doubt it a bit. Many horror authors are asked this question. Have you ever written a story that frightened you so badly that you believed it was too scary to publish? I don't know if all of them have an answer to this question, but Stephen King certainly did. Pet Sematary was the book in which he buried in a drawer shortly after reading the rough draft, thinking he'd finally gone too far, that he'd formed conclusions too bleak and disturbing to be brought out into the public light. He was wrong, of course. The novel to end his contract with Doubleday before he moved on to New American Library, the book sold 657,000 copies without publicity from the author that first year. To this day, King still expresses that he doesn't like the book. In an interview 1 year after it was published, King said, quote, "If I had my way about it, I still would not have published Pet Sematary. I don't like it. It's a terrible book, not in terms of the writing, but it just spirals down into darkness. It seems to be saying that nothing works and nothing is worth it, and I don't really believe that." End quote. The story originated during a period when King moved his family to Orono, Maine. As a means to give back to his alma mater, Stephen King had signed up to teach creative writing classes at the University of Maine. The street they lived on was busy with the travel of large trucks commuting with a nearby chemical plant. One day, Stephen's toddler son Owen made a run toward the road, and King managed to catch the child at the last second before one of the tanker trucks roared by. Stephen was haunted by the reality that if he'd just been a few seconds later, his son would have become a fatal victim to an automobile accident. Stephen has always described the process of how he receives inspiration for stories as two unrelated ideas linking together and forming something new. For example, in the novel Carrie originated from an article about the possibility of telekinesis developing in adolescent girls and combined with the subject about high school bullying. Pet Sematary originated from 3 incidents. The first was when the family cat Smucky was killed by one of the tanker trucks, and Stephen observed the process of grieving going on in his young daughter. The second ingredient was discovering a cemetery for neighborhood pets out in the woods behind the house. King imagined another burial ground beyond the pet cemetery, one that held a magic power to bring the dead who were buried there back to life. At first, the fantasy started with just imagining the family cat returning from the dead. But after the near-tragic incident with King's son Owen, King began to imagine a father burying his dead son in the magical burial ground. And that was how the story of Pet Sematary was conceived. Those of you out there that are considered big horror fans may also see how the novel is a riff upon the short story The Monkey's Paw by W. Jacob. The short story is about a family overwhelmed by the grief of their dead son, and they wish upon the monkey's paw to bring him back from the dead. The story ends in mystery. The husband is so horrified by the possibility of seeing his son decomposed and mutilated that he makes a third wish, and as they open the door to find nothing, the reader is left to meditate on the mysterious possibility of what could have been there. Stephen King's Pet Sematary seems to be an extension of this idea. The plot is as simple as a fairy tale. Aren't so many of the best stories this way? Louis Creed has moved his family, Rachel his wife, daughter Eileen, baby son Gage, and the family cat Church, from Chicago to the small town of Ludlow, Maine. Lewis is to become the campus doctor at the university infirmary. They move into a big house across the street from Judd and Norma Crandall, and the move-in process begins with problems. Ellie hurts her knee after falling off a swing, and Gage is stung by a bee. The new neighbor, Judd Crandall, steps in and helps out. During this process, he also warns Lewis and Rachel about how busy the road can get. Judd and Lewis become close friends almost immediately. Lewis, who lost his father at the age of 3, begins to look at Judd as a surrogate father. A few weeks in, Judd takes the Creed family on a walk along a path into the woods behind the house. This is where the pet cemetery is first introduced, and it provokes an argument between Lewis and his wife. Rachel, having been traumatized by her sister's painful death with spinal meningitis, brought up by flashbacks throughout the book, feels uncomfortable about Ellie being exposed to death at the pet cemetery. She worries how it may affect her. In a later scene, Lewis experiences a traumatic death experience just several weeks into his job as a campus doctor. A student named Victor Pascal is fatally injured in a car accident, and the victim addresses Lewis with his dying words. Victor Pascal then appears in Lewis's dream the night after the accident, and leads Lewis to the deadfall by the pet cemetery. He warns Lewis not to go beyond the deadfall, no matter how strongly he feels he needs to. The family cat is later killed by one of the tanker trucks, and Judd, as repayment to Lewis for saving his wife Norma from a near-fatal heart attack, guides Lewis out to the Micmac burial ground beyond the pet cemetery. It is there that the cat is buried, and the next afternoon the cat returns, but it is not right, to say the least. The cat hunts mice and birds to rip them apart, but doesn't eat them. No longer is the cat lively, but stiff and awkward, and an awful stench lingers around it. Once the Creed family's young son is killed by a speeding truck, and the walls of grief seem to isolate and disintegrate the family unity, the novel takes a deep plunge into dark morbidity as Lewis exhumes his son's dead body and reburies him in the Micmac burial ground. The novel discusses a theme about the strong, gravitational-like pull of aging and the symptoms that come by it, like Norma's arthritis and heart attack, to the bittersweet realization as to how Ellie's childhood seems to be vanishing in a blink of an eye. In one scene, Rachel sobs after dropping Ellie off for her first day at school in Ludlow, shocked by how much the time has flown by and how unstoppable that flow is. King also writes about the comfortable routines of our daily lives and how they can fall into a pattern. Every evening after spending time with the kids, Lewis enjoys a beer and conversation with Judd, and then returns home to make love with his wife before bed. The novel's deepest theme deals with the subject of death, of course. It highlights how fragile we human beings are, and how susceptible we are to death. In a scene where Lewis is helping his daughter Ellie confront the possibility of the family cat dying, King illustrates the essence of this theme very well. Quote, "He held her and rocked her, believing, rightly or wrongly, that Ellie wept for the very intractability of death, its imperviousness to argument or to a little girl's tears, that she wept over its cruel unpredictability, and that she wept because of the human being's wonderful, deadly ability to translate symbols into conclusions that were either fine and noble or blackly terrifying." End quote. The novel itself is King's translation of death's symbol into a blackly terrifying conclusion. Not so much concerning the dead, but those who are affected by the dead. That's what's truly terrifying. Judd Crandall warns at one point in the novel that sometimes dead is better. I saw this line personally as a statement that, to bear the harshness of mortality, we have to accept the will of God. Within the context of Pet Sematary, it seems to say that if we harbor a fixation on dead things in our lives, whether a loved one, other dreams, other investments, you name it, that our reasonable and clear thinking can become twisted and diluted. The overall flow of the narrative is well focused and engaging. King does a great job remaining invested in the story and doesn't sidetrack too far into immaterial territory. One scene almost veers into the immaterial when Lewis returns home after the tragic incident with Pascal, and his wife treats him with a sexual act in the bathtub. There's nothing gratuitous or offensive about the scene, and it does a fair job developing the characters and their relationship with one another, showing Lewis's vulnerability and how much he depends on his wife when he's vulnerable, which plays a vital role later in the novel when grief overwhelms the family after the death of Gage. However, the scene comes off a little jarring juxtaposed to the tragedy coming before it, and it does little to move the plot. The merits of character development carry it alone. Some of the final moments when Gage returns from the dead, twisted and evil, come across a little corny in my mind, bringing to mind the movie Child's Play. However, I find this forgivable, because I was so invested in the family's grief leading up to that point that I couldn't help but be invested and convinced. I highly recommend this novel, which is a fan favorite, and rightly so. It demonstrates what we love so much about Stephen King, his willingness to follow his imagination where it wants to take him, no matter how dark of a place that is, and his honesty as he transcribes it to the written word.